Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at Morphy's taking a look at a Colt 1911. It's not just a normal one. This is a British contract World War I Colt 1911 that is not chambered for 45 ACP. It is chambered for the British 455 Webley semi-rimmed self-loading cartridge. It just has to be a little different. Now the reason for this is there were a couple elements of the British military, most notably the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Horse Artillery, that had decided that they wanted a self-loading pistol a little before World War I. And what they ended up choosing was a Webley model of self-loading pistol, like that one. So it's not a bad pistol. It doesn't particularly do anything better than the 1911. And it took a long time, and it was relatively expensive to make. And this was okay before World War I broke out. And they were just finalizing the cartridge and the design and getting everything just quite right in about 1913. Well, once war breaks out, Webley has a hard time providing these pistols as quickly as the British military would really like to have them. And so in 1916, well, they start looking for an alternative. And in 1916, they place an order, May of 1916, for 500 Colt 1911 pistols that are modified to use the same 455 Webley self-loading cartridge as the Webley automatic pistol. This isn't that big of a deal for Colt to make. These two cartridges, this and 45 ACP, are very similar. And so Colt is able to make a couple tweaks to the barrel, obviously, the breech face, and the magazine, and supply Britain with these pistols. Now, the British are going to follow this up with a contract for a repeating order of 200 pistols per month. By January of 1917, they up that to 300 pistols a month. And by the end of the war, they've accumulated, or acquired, some 12,009 of them. Now, there were a couple changes that would happen during the course of the war. In April of 1918, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service are amalgamated together to form the Royal Air Force. At that point, these pistols would start being marked RAF, but until then, they don't have any specific unit markings on them. Well, we'll talk more about where the pistols went after we take a closer look at exactly what differentiates them from any other Colt 1911. First off, it's important to differentiate between the two main 455 Webley cartridges. The one that people are most familiar with, and was by far the most common, was the revolver cartridge, which is a significantly rimmed, well, it's a revolver cartridge, goes all the way back to black powder days. The 455 self-loading cartridge was developed because the Webley self-loading pistols needed to be 455 caliber. They needed to have basically the same ballistics as the revolver, but they couldn't handle the large rim of the revolver cartridge. It just wasn't a good fit for box magazines. So Webley developed this round instead. The cartridge was initially developed like 1904. It was finalized in 1913. A few changes to the rim thickness primarily at the end, but the final version here is virtually identical in length to the 45 automatic, 45 ACP here. 45 ACP is a 230 grain bullet traveling at 850 feet per second. The 455 Webley self-loader was a 224 grain bullet traveling at about 700 feet per second. So slightly less powerful than 45 auto, but for all practical purposes, just as good. Now, obviously, there's a huge potential for confusion in the field between 455 revolver and 455 self-loading, and so when the ammunition was packaged, it was specifically marked not for revolvers, and you'll see it also is, it says right here, pistol self-loading, Webley and Scott. And so that they kind of did their best there to prevent mix-ups, and frankly, there wasn't a lot of 455 self-loading being used, so that's what the ammunition looks like. Now, because of the similarity in cartridge overall size and similarity in power levels, it was not that big a deal for Colt to adapt the 1911 to this new cartridge and sell it to the British. There are changes to the barrel, obviously, to chamber the different cartridge, change to the breech face to properly hold the semi-rimmed cartridge. 455 self-loader is semi-rimmed. Colt was quite familiar with semi-rimmed cartridges from their work with a lot of Browning's early semi-rimmed cartridges like 32 ACP and 38 ACP. There are no visible mechanical changes on the outside of the pistol, only markings. So where normally they would say caliber 45 on the British contract ones, they're caliber 455. We have serial numbers with a W-prefix, which is for Webley. These are not a specific standalone serial number range. They are in the same range as the commercial pistols that Colt was making at the same time. And the British guns don't consist of a single discrete range. You'll find W-prefixed guns between like 29,000 and 97,000. The RAF, by the way, which came into being in 1918, being officially called the RAF instead of the Royal Flying Corps, they would continue to order these pistols into 1919, and after that point, you'll see them also stamped RAF. But the early ones for the Horse Artillery and the Flying Corps didn't have a specific unit designation or marking. The magazines are also identifiable for these because they are just slightly tweaked to properly feed 455 semi-rimmed ammo, and on the bottom, they will be marked caliber .455 Ely, which isn't really an official designation of the cartridge, but Ely was one of the main manufacturers, and it's not uncommon to find it referenced as 455 Ely in some of the period literature. So this is the early pattern of Colt magazine with a lanyard loop on the bottom and a two-tone finish there because the top end was hardened, the bottom end was not, because it didn't need to be. So magazines look normal, but check for those distinctive caliber markings on the base plate. These tear apart just like any other 1911, so I don't need to bore you with that detail. There are a couple markings on the inside, though, that are distinctive. One is the E here on the top of the frame inside, and that is for England. That's a Colt marking. This is relevant because this is only present on the British government orders. So if you happen to have a 455 Webley caliber pistol that was privately purchased from Colt, it will not have that marking. Next up, we have some really tiny little marks on the barrel extension or barrel lug here. This one is the British inspector's mark. So that will have a crown. It will have a generally 2-digit letter and or number code, and that is in an individual inspector's code, and then an E. And the E here stands for Enfield. There were some that were inspected by the British inspector in the United States. Those will have an A at the bottom for America. And we have some additional proof marks on the opposite side, including the crossed flag or crossed pennant British proof mark of the time. On the frame, you will find the same sort of inspector's marking on the trigger guard here. The E didn't fully stamp out on that one, but this was inspected at Enfield. And then up here we have the crossed pennant proof mark and a British broad arrow government property mark. And that crossed pennant proof mark is also on the back of the slide over the rampant Colt. It's a little hazy as to exactly who was getting the 455 caliber 1911s. Now the British did also order 45 ACP caliber 1911s during the war, but that's kind of a separate issue. We know that the Horse Artillery were interested, the Royal Navy was interested, all of the Flying Corps elements were interested in these, but by the end of the war, it appears that most of the pistols pretty much ended up with the newly formed RAF. And they would actually stay in service with the RAF through World War II. After that, a bunch of them were surplused off by the British government, so they will sometimes be found with commercial proofs indicating that sale. But of course, some of them came out of service before World War II, like this one, and don't show any additional markings to explain their provenance over the years. So that is, I think, one of the most interesting of Colt's international sales of 1911, since just about the only one that they did in a unique and different caliber other than their own 45 and 38 calibers. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.